History remembers him as the savior who pulled the trigger on the mad monk, Rasputin. But the man holding the gun was a figure who defied every rule of the Russian Empire. Prince Felix Yusupov was the wealthiest man in Russia, a husband to the Tsar's niece, and a cold-blooded assassin. He was also a man who scandalized society by wearing diamonds, silk gowns, and singing in the cabarets of Paris. In a world that demanded men be soldiers made of iron, Felix was a creature of ambiguity, fluidly moving between the masculine and the feminine. Yet when the Romanov dynasty began to crumble, it wasn't the rugged generals who acted, it was the prince in the dress. How did a boy raised to be a doll find the strength to commit the century's most violent crime? The answer lies in a tragic wish made before he was even born. While the world demanded soldiers, in the heart of St. Petersburg, a different kind of tragedy was being set. Here the problem wasn't a father who demanded a warrior, it was a mother who desperately wanted a girl. The world Felix Yusupov was born into defies modern comprehension. The Yusupovs were not just rich, they were an economy unto themselves. While the Tsar answered to ministers, the Yusupovs answered only to God. They owned 4 palaces in St. Petersburg, 37 massive estates, and mines that fueled the nation. Before 1861, they owned 40,000 human beings. But in Russia, gold always comes with blood. The family was haunted by the curse. In every generation, only one male heir shall survive to 26. All others shall perish. For 3 centuries, the prophecy held. Fathers buried sons until the colossal fortune rested on one sole heiress, Princess Zinaida Yusupova. She was the most beautiful woman in Russia, incredibly wealthy and deeply terrified. She had survived, but she lived in fear that the curse would come for her children. In 1887, at the Moika Palace, Zinaida went into labor. She had already lost 2 sons. Only one, Nicholas, was alive. Desperate to cheat the curse, she prayed for a daughter. A girl would be safe. A girl would be a companion. A girl would not be hunted by the number 26. When the doctors announced the baby was a boy, Zinaida didn't celebrate. She turned her face to the wall and wept. She rejected his gender from the very first breath. This moment set the stage for one of the strangest psychological experiments in history. A boy raised by a mother who wished he was a girl. They named him Felix, meaning lucky or happy. It was a hopeful shield against the darkness of his heritage. But Zinaida, a woman who had never been denied anything her money could buy, decided to simply ignore the biological reality of her son. If nature wouldn't give her a daughter, she would craft one. From the moment he could stand, Felix was inducted into a world of softness that was strictly forbidden to male children of the nobility. While other boys were given wooden swords and toy soldiers, Felix was swathed in lace, velvet, and satin. His hair was kept long, falling in golden ringlets past his shoulders. Zinaida did not just dress him, she curated him. She called him my little girl in private moments, praising his delicate features, his small hands, his high cheekbones that mirrored her own. This was not done with malice. In Zinaida's mind, it was a game, a whimsical escape from the rigidity of court life. But for a child, there is no distinction between a game and reality. Felix learned early on that his mother's love shone brightest when he was beautiful, not when he was strong. He learned that masculinity, represented by his distant soldier father, Count Sumarokov Elston, was boring, gray, and stiff. Femininity, represented by his mother, was power, color, and adoration. The contrast between Felix and his older brother Nicholas could not have been more stark. Nicholas was the spare who had become the heir due to the infant deaths. He was everything a Russian prince should be: tall, handsome in a rugged way, a rebel in the traditional sense of drinking and dueling, but undeniably male. He was being groomed to take over the mines and the estates. He smoked, he rode horses, he chased women. Felix, on the other hand, was the doll. He was the baby. Because he was the younger son, the pressure of the curse seemed to skip him initially. He was allowed to stay in the nursery, in the women's quarters, far longer than was custom. He absorbed the mannerisms of the ladies in waiting. He learned the language of fans and fabric. He realized that clothes were not just functional items to keep you warm. They were costumes that dictated how the world treated you. One particular incident from his early childhood illustrates this profound confusion. At the age of 5, dressed in a white dress with blue ribbons that his mother adored, a visiting general patted him on the head and exclaimed, "What a charming little girl." Felix, flush with pride rather than shame, curtsied. He later recalled the moment not as embarrassing, but as a triumph. He had successfully deceived an authority figure. He had passed. As he grew into adolescence, the game began to bleed into the streets. What started as a mother's whim became Felix's own rebellion. The Russian aristocracy was a world of suffocating rules. A prince did not run, he marched. A prince did not laugh loudly, he chuckled politely. A prince wore a uniform, always. The uniform was the skin of the state. To take it off was treason. Felix hated the uniform. He hated the scratchy wool, the high collars, the anonymity of it. He craved the sensation of silk and the individual expression of fashion. The first major transgression occurred when he was barely a teenager. His parents were away, and the house was asleep. Driven by a compulsion he barely understood, Felix crept into his mother's dressing room. The room was a temple of femininity, smelling of French perfume and powder. He began to try on her clothes, not as a joke, but with a serious, almost scholarly intensity. He pulled on the silk stockings, fastened the garters, and slipped into a beaded evening gown. He looked in the mirror and saw someone else. The weak, sickly boy who was terrible at sports and bored by military history vanished. In his place was a creature of mystery and allure. Emboldened, he didn't just stay in the room. He wrapped himself in a fur pelisse to hide the gown and slipped out of the Moika Palace into the St. Petersburg night. He walked the Nevsky Prospect, the city's main artery, terrified and exhilarated. Men glanced at him, not with the respectful nod given to a prince, but with the hungry look given to a woman. For the first time in his life, Felix felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with his title. It was the power of attraction, of deception. He returned home undetected, shivering and triumphant. The die was cast. The duality of his life had begun. By day, he was the lazy, artistic schoolboy, Prince Felix. By night, he was a shapeshifter. But the real turning point, the event that would shatter his childhood fantasy and force him into the cold light of responsibility, arrived in 1908. His brother Nicholas, now 26 years old, the fatal age, had fallen in love. But as was the Yusupov way, it was a tragic, forbidden love. He was infatuated with Marina de Haydn, a woman already engaged to Count Arvid Manteuffel. The affair was scandalous, public, and messy. Nicholas, arrogant and believing the Yusupov name protected him from everything, ignored the warnings. Manteuffel challenged Nicholas to a duel. It was meant to be a formality, a way to satisfy honor without bloodshed. But the curse demanded its due. On a crisp morning on the Krestovsky Island, the two men faced off with revolvers. Nicholas fired into the air, a gentleman's gesture to end the quarrel. Manteuffel did not. He took careful aim and shot the air to the Yusupov fortune through the heart. Nicholas died instantly. The news broke Zenaida. She collapsed, screaming. that the curse had taken him, that she had known it would happen the moment he turned 26. The palace was draped in black crepe. The mirrors were covered. The silence was deafening. Felix was 21 years old. In the span of a single gunshot, his world inverted. He was no longer the spare, the artistic indulgence, the boy allowed to play dress-up in the shadow of his strong brother. He was now the sole surviving heir. The mines, the oil fields, the palaces, the 40,000 former serfs, the weight of the Romanov alliance, it all crashed down on him. He stood at his brother's grave, looking at the fresh earth. He saw his father stoic and angry, looking at him with a gaze that clearly said, "Why him? Why are we left with the boy who plays with dolls while the soldier is dead?" Felix felt the crushing expectation. He was expected to step into Nicholas's boots. He was expected to marry, to breed, to command, to be a man in the way Russia defined a man. But looking down at his own hands, soft and manicured, Felix knew he could not simply become Nicholas. The girl his mother had created was too much a part of him. He made a silent vow at the graveside. He would not let the sadness kill him. He would not become a gray, obedient copy of his father. He would survive the curse, but he would do it on his own terms. He would turn his life into a work of art, no matter how shocking it might be to the society that now looked to him for leadership. The tragedy didn't tame him, it unchained him. With Nicholas gone, there was no one left to overshadow him. The immense resources of the family were now his to command. And Prince Felix Yusupov, the new heir to the greatest fortune in Russia, decided that if he was going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he would do it wearing diamonds and singing a French cabaret song. The grave of Nicholas Yusupov was still fresh, the earth piled high and black against the winter snow, when the silence of the Moika Palace became unbearable for Felix. The grief in the house was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of weeping mothers and stoic, disappointed fathers. Every room whispered the name of the dead heir. Every servant looked at Felix with eyes that seemed to say, "It should have been you." Felix could not breathe in that house. He could not be the son they wanted, the replacement Nicholas, the somber administrator of estates. The sheer magnitude of the family fortune, rather than comforting him, felt like a prison wall closing in. He needed an escape, not just from the palace, but from himself. He needed to shed the skin of Prince Felix Yusupov, the survivor, and become someone else entirely, someone without a past, someone without a curse. This desire for oblivion drove him back to the game of his childhood, but the stakes had changed. It was no longer a nursery whim encouraged by a doting mother. It was a desperate, dangerous psychological necessity, and he found his accomplice in the most unlikely of places, his dead brother's life. Before his death, Nicholas had kept a mistress named Polya. She was everything the Yusupovs were not: common, vibrant, unrefined, and alive. In the wake of the duel, while the family was paralyzed by mourning, Felix found himself drawn to Polya. Perhaps he was looking for a connection to the brother he had lost, or perhaps he was drawn to the freedom she represented. She was a woman of the demi-monde, living on the fringes of polite society in a world of late nights, loud music, and loose morals. One evening, while visiting her apartment, a strange whim seized him. He looked at her clothes, the silks, the furs, the feathers of a kept woman, and felt that familiar electric pull. He asked to try them on. It was a macabre request. The brother of the dead lover, asking to wear the mistress's clothes. But Polya, perhaps sensing the deep, twisted grief in the boy, agreed. The transformation was startling. Felix was 21, slender, with the high cheekbones of his Tatar ancestors and large, melancholy eyes. When he slipped into Polya's gown, he didn't look like a man in a dress. He looked like a woman, a tall, somewhat angular, but strikingly beautiful woman. He stood before the mirror, and for the first time in months, the crushing weight of the Yusupov curse vanished. The reflection didn't show the sole heir to a mining empire. It showed a stranger, a nobody. And in that anonymity, Felix found a drug more potent than the opium that was popular in St. Petersburg dens. "Let's go out," he said. It was madness. If discovered, the scandal would be nuclear. The Tsar was the head of the church and the state. His nobles were expected to be pillars of moral rectitude. For a prince of the blood to be caught parading as a prostitute, for that is what a woman alone at night was assumed to be, would be social suicide. It could lead to exile, the stripping of titles, perhaps even an asylum. But Felix didn't care. The danger was the point. The danger made him feel alive. They went to the aquarium, a popular entertainment garden. Felix walked with his head high, learning in real time how to move in heels, how to hold a fan to obscure the slightly too sharp line of his jaw. He discovered he had a natural talent for it. He wasn't just mimicking women, he was channeling an energy he had suppressed for years. Men stared. Officers who would have saluted Prince Felix with rigid deference now looked at this unknown French actress with predatory hunger. Felix reveled in it. He later wrote that he felt a perverse thrill in seeing the aristocracy from the other side. He saw the lust, the hypocrisy, the unguarded drunkenness of the men who claimed to rule Russia. He was a spy in the house of gender. The escapades became frequent. He created a persona. He was no longer Felix. He was a French chanteuse, a mysterious beauty drifting through the St. Petersburg winter. He learned that the key to passing was confidence. If you walked as if you owned the room, people assumed you belonged there. He began to sing in the clubs, low, sultry French songs that required more attitude than vocal range. The applause was intoxicating. It was validation not for his name or his money, but for him, or at least for the creation he had built. But the addiction to the disguise demanded greater risks. The aquarium was too safe, too anonymous. He wanted to test himself against the elite. He set his sights on the Bear. The Bear was not just a club. It was the inner sanctum of St. Petersburg nightlife. It was where the Grand Dukes drank, where the wealthiest merchants burned through rubles, where the most expensive courtesans held court. To enter the Bear was to walk into the lion's den. Everyone there knew the Yusupov family. Everyone there knew Felix's face. On the night of the operation, Felix prepared with the meticulousness of a bank robber. He chose a magnificent gown of blue silk. He spent hours on his makeup, using theatrical techniques to soften his brow and widen his eyes. But then, in a moment of supreme arrogance, or perhaps a subconscious desire to be caught, he made a fatal error. He opened the family safe. He bypassed the simple costume jewelry and reached for the real Yusupov collection. He selected a set of diamonds, earrings that dripped with fire, and a necklace of massive solitaires. These were not generic gems. They were heirlooms famous in Russian society, cataloged and recognized by jewelers and courtiers alike. To wear them was to wear a neon sign reading Yusupov. Polya warned him. She told him he was insane. But Felix was high on his own invincibility. He draped the diamonds around his neck, the cold stones settling against his skin like a promise of disaster. They arrived at the Bear late. The room was a haze of cigar smoke and expensive perfume. Gypsies were singing in the corner. Champagne was flowing like water. Felix swept in, the diamonds catching the light, sending fractured rainbows across the room. The effect was immediate. Conversation stalled. Heads turned. Who was this stunning woman dripping in a king's ransom of jewels? He took a table near the front. He ordered champagne. He felt the eyes of the room on him, heavy and hot. He saw officers leaning in, whispering. He saw a Grand Duke at a nearby table squinting through his monocle. The thrill was electric. He was pulling off the greatest trick of his life. Then the mood shifted. A group of English travelers was seated nearby. They weren't looking at his face. They were looking at the necklace. One of them, a man who had perhaps seen Zinaida Yusupova at a ball or seen photographs of the family treasures, leaned over to his companion. Felix caught the whisper, or perhaps he just felt the change in the air pressure. Those stones, I've seen them. That's the Yusupov star. The whisper spread like a virus. It jumped from table to table. Yusupov, the prince, the dead brother, the boy. The manager of the club, a man who knew every aristocrat in the city, began to make his way toward Felix's table. His face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He had realized that the French beauty had the exact same nose as the boy he had seen dining with his father a month ago. Felix froze. The game was over. The reality of his situation crashed down. He was a prince of the empire, sitting in a nightclub in drag, wearing his mother's diamonds, about to be unmasked in front of the very men who commanded his country's armies. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He couldn't speak. His baritone voice would betray him instantly. He couldn't run. The dress was too tight, the heels too high. He did the only thing his dramatic soul could conceive. He created a distraction. He grabbed the heavy crystal champagne bottle from the ice bucket. He didn't aim for a person. He aimed for the wall where the primitive electrical fuse box for the dining room hummed. With a grunt of effort, he hurled the bottle. Crash. The impact was perfect. Glass shattered. Sparks showered down like fireworks. And with a sizzling pop, the lights died. The main room of the bear plunged into absolute darkness. Screams erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor. In the sudden blackness, Felix moved. He didn't run like a man. He scrambled. He kicked off the heels. He hiked up the silk skirt and bolted for the service exit, shoving past confused waiters and stumbling drunks. He burst out into the alleyway. The cold Russian air hit him like a slap. He was panting, his wig askew, his makeup smudged, standing in the snow in his socks. He didn't stop. He ran through the frozen streets, flagging down a passing sleigh, throwing money at the driver, and burying his face in his furs until he reached the safety of the Moika Palace. He collapsed in his room, heart hammering against his ribs. He had escaped, but he had left something behind. In the chaos of the flight, or perhaps during the run through the snow, the necklace had come loose. The next morning, the hangover of reality set in. Felix sat in his room, waiting. It didn't take long. The major domo announced a visitor, the owner of the bear. He wasn't there to blackmail. He was there to return property. He handed a velvet pouch to Felix's father, Count Sumarokov Elston. Inside was the diamond necklace. "We found this on the floor, Your Excellency," the owner said, his voice dripping with awkward politeness. After the disturbance caused by the young lady, the Count looked at the diamonds, he looked at the owner, and then he looked upstairs toward Felix's room. The explosion that followed was not physical, but it was just as violent. His father was a military man, a man of honor and rigid codes. To him, this was not a prank. It was a perversion. It was a sign that the Yusupov blood, the blood of khans and warriors, had curdled in Felix's veins. He saw his son as a broken thing, a degenerate who would ruin the family name. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was informed. The gossip had reached the Winter Palace before lunch. The reaction from the imperial family was a mixture of disgust and pity. They suggested that Felix be sent to a monastery for correction. Others suggested the army, to beat the femininity out of him. But Zenaida stood between her son and the world. She, who had dressed him in those laces as a baby, refused to let him be destroyed for a nature she had helped nurture. She argued that he was grieving. She argued that he was young. She argued that he was an artist. However, even she knew that he could not stay in St. Petersburg. The scandal was too fresh, the whispers too loud. Everywhere Felix went, he saw the smirks. There goes the girl, their eyes said. There goes the prince in the dress. The solution was exile, but a gentle one. He would be sent away from the toxic, gossiping fishbowl of St. Petersburg society. He would go to a place where eccentricities were tolerated, where young men were educated, and where he could perhaps learn to be a proper English gentleman. He was sent to Oxford. It was meant to be a punishment, a reform school disguised as a university. His parents hoped the gray stone walls and the stiff upper lip of the British aristocracy would straighten him out. They hoped he would forget the silk dresses and the cabaret lights. But they were wrong. Oxford would not tame Felix Yusupov. Instead, it would give him a stage. It would introduce him to a world of aestheticism, to the lingering ghosts of Oscar Wilde, and to a freedom of thought that Russia's autocracy had never permitted. And most importantly, his time away would make him yearn for home with a fierce, blinding patriotism. He would return to Russia not cured, but emboldened. And waiting for him, there would be the other half of his soul, the man who would complete the tragedy. Grand Duke Dmitri was waiting, and so was the monk. The cabaret singer was gone. The assassin was beginning to form. The gray stone spires of Oxford University were a world away from the golden domes of St. Petersburg. In 1909, when Felix arrived in England, he was 22 years old, an exile in a land of damp fog, stiff tweed, and even stiffer manners. His parents had sent him there to be corrected, to have the Russian eccentricity drained out of him by the sober traditions of the English aristocracy. They hoped he would return a serious man, a carbon copy of a British lord, ready to manage the Yusupov empire with dull efficiency. They underestimated him. Felix did not adapt to Oxford. Oxford adapted to Felix. He arrived not as a penitent student, but as a visiting potentate. While other students lived in drafty dormitories and ate boiled mutton, Felix rented a luxurious apartment on the high street. He had it redecorated with Russian tapestries, icons, and silks. He brought his own chef, his own valet, and a menagerie of pets, including a French bulldog named Punch and a macaw that screamed in Russian. He refused to wear the drab English cut of the day, appearing instead in velvet jackets and flowing ties, looking like a character who had walked out of an Oscar Wilde play and gotten lost in a foggy quadrangle. His time at University College was less about academics and more about aestheticism. He fell in with the Bullingdon Club crowd, the wealthy, reckless sons of the British elite, but he remained distinct. To the English, he was an exotic creature, the Russian prince, who possessed more money than God and a terrifying melancholy charm. He didn't hide his nature, he refined it. In England, he discovered the philosophy of art for art's sake. He realized that his life didn't have to be a tragedy or a duty. It could be a performance. He also found a new kind of freedom. In Russia, he was watched by the Tsar's secret police and his mother's spies. In Oxford, he was just the prince. He could explore his identity with a degree of safety he had never known. He formed intense romantic friendships with other young men, relationships that were accepted in the unspoken, coded world of the university elite. These years were a respite, a deep breath before the plunge back into the freezing waters of Russian politics. But the Yusupov curse was patient. It waited for him to return. In 1913, Felix returned to St. Petersburg. He was 26 years old, the age that had killed his brother. The psychological weight of that number must have been immense. Every day he woke up, he defied the family legend. He had survived the fatal year. He was now the master of his own destiny and the most eligible bachelor in the empire. The pressure to marry was absolute. The Yusupov fortune could not end with him. He needed an heir. But Felix, true to his nature, could not settle for a conventional arranged marriage. He set his sights on the highest possible prize, a union that would not only secure his line, but protect him from his critics. He chose Princess Irina Alexandrovna Romanova. Irina was the Tsar's niece, the daughter of Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, and Grand Duchess Xenia, the Tsar's sister. She was royalty of the blood. Marrying her would make Felix a member of the imperial family by marriage. It was a shield. Who would dare call the Tsar's nephew-in-law a degenerate? But it wasn't just a political move. By all accounts, Felix was genuinely captivated by Irina. She was not a typical Romanov. She was shy, tall, and possessed a haunting, silent beauty that matched his own. She was described by contemporaries as having eyes that held the sadness of the Russian soul. In her, Felix saw a mirror. She was an outsider in her own family, quiet and observational. When Felix approached her parents, there was hesitation. The Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, the Tsar's mother, had heard the rumors about Felix. She knew about the dressing up, the scandals, the wild nights. She called him that dreadful boy. But Irina was adamant. She saw something in Felix that the others missed. Perhaps his vulnerability, or perhaps she simply found his flamboyant spirit a relief from the stifling boredom of the court. They were married in February 1914 in the chapel of the Anichkov Palace. It was the social event of the decade. The Tsar gave Irina away. Felix wore the uniform of the nobility, gold-braided and stiff, but he looked triumphant. They were dubbed the most beautiful couple in Russia. And indeed, they were striking, both tall, both slender, both pale, looking less like husband and wife, and more like ethereal siblings cast in porcelain. For a brief moment, it seemed Felix had won. He had the money, the title, the beautiful royal wife, and he had survived the curse. He began to renovate the Moika Palace, creating a private apartment for himself and Irina that was a masterpiece of modern taste, a garçonnière filled with white fur rugs, rock crystal chandeliers, and hidden doors. But history does not allow for happy endings in 1914 Russia. That summer, the world broke. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The alliances triggered like mousetraps. Germany declared war on Russia. St. Petersburg changed its name to Petrograd to sound less German. The ball stopped. The music stopped. The golden age was over, replaced by the iron gray of war. While other young noblemen rushed to the front to lead cavalry charges, Felix did not. He used his status and likely his mother's influence to avoid active service, claiming health issues. This decision was disastrous for his reputation. To the patriots, he was a coward. While the flower of Russian youth was dying in the mud of Tannenberg, Prince Yusupov was sitting in his white fur room in the Moika. Stung by the criticism, Felix threw himself into relief work. He converted one of his palaces into a hospital for wounded soldiers. But he didn't just write checks. He walked the wards. And what he saw there changed him. He saw the broken bodies of peasants who had been sent to fight without rifles. He saw the gangrene, the starvation, the utter incompetence of the military leadership. He realized that the Russia he loved was being led off a cliff by a government that was corrupt, inept, and paralyzed. And at the center of that paralysis was a single name, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was no longer the wandering pilgrim of the early 1900s. By 1915, he was the shadow ruler of Russia. With the Tsar away at the front commanding the army, the Empress Alexandra was left in charge of Petrograd. And the Empress listened only to Rasputin. The holy man convinced her that he alone could keep her hemophiliac son, the Tsarevich Alexei, alive. Because of this leverage, Rasputin had the power to hire and fire ministers. Incompetent sycophants were appointed to run the war efforts simply because they praised Rasputin. Capable generals were dismissed because they looked at him sideways. Felix watched this with a growing cold rage. He was a snob. Yes, he was an elitist. And that elitism made him hate Rasputin with a burning passion. He saw Rasputin not as a holy man, but as a dirty, illiterate peasant who had crawled out of the Siberian mud to defile the sacred institution of the monarchy. It was a clash of aesthetics as much as politics. Felix, the Prince of Refinement, could not stomach the idea that the fate of his empire rested in the greasy hands of a man who ate soup with his fingers and smelled of goat. But Felix couldn't act alone. He needed an ally. He needed someone who felt the shame of the Romanovs as deeply as he did. He found him in Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich. Dmitri was everything Felix was but royal. He was the Tsar's first cousin, young, dashing, and an Olympic horseman. He had been a favorite of the Tsar and Tsarina, almost a surrogate son to them, but he had been pushed aside. The Empress had turned against him largely because Dmitri hated Rasputin and refused to bow to him. Felix and Dmitri's relationship in the years leading up to 1916 is the emotional core of this tragedy. They became inseparable. They were seen everywhere together, the slender, dark-eyed prince and the tall, athletic Grand Duke. They were the Dioscuri of the dying empire. Historians have debated the nature of their bond for a century. Was it sexual? Almost certainly, though likely fluid and unspoken in the way of their class. But it was more than that. It was a trauma bond. Both men were isolated, both were incredibly privileged, yet powerless to stop the train wreck of the war. Both were hated by the Empress. The Empress Alexandra referred to Felix in her letters as the malicious one. She forbade Dmitri from seeing him, claiming Felix was a corrupting influence who would drag the Grand Duke down into degeneracy. This opposition only welded them closer together. They spent long nights at the Moika Palace drinking wine and discussing the state of Russia. It was in these wine-soaked conversations that the idea began to form. At first, it was just talk, the idle, angry talk of young men who feel the world is wrong. Someone should do something. Someone should remove him. If he were gone, the Tsar would return. The Empress would wake up. Russia would be saved. But slowly, the talk turned to planning. Felix began to stalk his prey. He needed to understand Rasputin. In a move of supreme nerve, Felix sought out the monk. He claimed he had chest pains, a sickness of the soul, and asked for Rasputin's healing. Rasputin, flattered that the richest man in Russia was seeking his help, welcomed Felix. He called him the little one. Felix's descriptions of these meetings are skin-crawling. He describes Rasputin's eyes, pale, hypnotic, and terrifying. He describes the monk's heavy, hypnotic voice. He describes how Rasputin would sit close to him, touching his arm, speaking of salvation and sin. Felix, the great actor, played the role of the confused disciple perfectly. He let Rasputin believe he was falling under his spell. But internally, Felix was recoiling. He saw Rasputin as a creature of pure malice. He wrote later that he felt a physical slime in Rasputin's presence. He became convinced that Rasputin was not just a charlatan, but a supernatural force of evil, a devil that had bewitched the empress. And if Rasputin was the devil, then Felix Yusupov would have to be the archangel Michael. By the winter of 1916, the situation in Petrograd was critical. The bread lines were miles long. The soldiers were deserting in the thousands. The aristocracy was in a panic, sensing the revolution in the air. The Tsar was at the front, unreachable. The Empress was in the palace, listening only to our friend. Felix and Dmitri realized they could wait no longer. If Russia was to survive the winter, Rasputin had to die before the new year. They brought in others. Vladimir Purishkevich, a loud-mouthed right-wing politician who had denounced Rasputin in the Duma. Dr. Lazovert, a military doctor who would provide the poison. Lieutenant Sukhotin, a young officer recovering from wounds. The cast was assembled. The stage was the cellar of the Moika Palace. The script was written. But as Felix looked at Dmitri across the table in those final days of December, he must have felt the ghost of the Yusupov curse laughing at him. He had spent his life trying to escape the grim destiny of his family, trying to be a creature of light and beauty. And now, to save the world he loved, he was about to commit the darkest sin of all. He was about to become a murderer. The dress-up games were over. The champagne bottles were put away. The prince picked up a revolver. The night of December 29th, 1916, did not feel like a night of murder. It felt like a stage play. The snow was falling in thick, silent sheets over St. Petersburg, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and distant factory whistles. The Moika Palace, usually a beacon of light and music, was dark, crouching against the frozen canal like a stone beast holding its breath. Inside the palace, the air was thick with the smell of floor wax, pine boughs, and nervous sweat. Prince Felix Yusupov was dressed in a simple tunic. Having shed his usual velvet jackets for something more practical, he checked the cellar room one last time. It was a masterpiece of deception. Just days before, it had been a bare wine storage area. Now, it was a cozy bachelor's dining room. Persian rugs covered the stone floor to dampen the sound of falling bodies. A fire crackled in the hearth, fighting the subterranean chill. On the table stood a spread that would have tempted a saint: chocolate cakes, petit four, and bottles of sweet Madeira wine. But the sweetness was a lie. Dr. Lazovert, the nervous military doctor brought into the conspiracy, had spent the last hour carefully lifting the crusts of the cakes and sprinkling potassium cyanide crystals inside. He had done the same to the wine glasses. There was enough poison on that table to kill a regiment of Cossacks. At midnight, Felix donned a heavy fur coat and a driver's cap. He took the wheel of a generic car. His own recognizable Rolls-Royce was hidden away, and drove to Rasputin's apartment at 64 Gorokovaya Street. Rasputin was waiting. The mad monk was not dressed in his usual peasant rags. He had groomed himself for the occasion. He wore a silk blouse embroidered with cornflowers, velvet breeches, and brand new boots that squeaked. His beard was combed and oiled. He smelled of cheap soap and the distinct musky scent of his own body. He was excited. He believed he was going to meet the beautiful Princess Irina. "She has guests upstairs," Felix lied smoothly as he ushered the giant monk into the car. "We will wait in the dining room downstairs until they leave. Then she will come down to you." Rasputin nodded, his eyes gleaming with lust and vanity. He trusted Felix. He called him the little one. He believed Felix was his creature, a weak boy he had tamed. He had no idea that the weak boy was driving him to his grave. When they entered the Moika, Felix led Rasputin down the winding spiral staircase into the cellar. The gramophone was playing Yankee Doodle, an absurdly cheerful American tune, chosen to mask any screams. They sat. The nightmare began. Felix offered Rasputin a cake. "Try the eclairs, Grigory Efimovitch," They are delicious. Rasputin declined. He just wanted the wine. Felix's heart hammered against his ribs. If he didn't eat the poison, the plan would fail. But after a few glasses of unpoisoned wine, Rasputin's appetite woke up. He reached for a cake. He ate one, then another. Felix watched, his hands trembling slightly, waiting for the convulsions. Cyanide is supposed to be fast. It cuts off the body's ability to use oxygen. The victim should choke, spasm, and die within minutes. Rasputin ate the cakes. He drank the poison Madeira, and nothing happened. He didn't gasp. He didn't clutch his throat. He just wiped the crumbs from his beard and asked for more wine. An hour passed, then 2. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Rasputin drank glass after glass of the poisoned wine. He became drunk, yes. He became melancholy. He began to talk about his beloved Russia, about the war, about God. But he did not die. Panic began to claw at Felix's throat. He was sitting across from a man who had consumed enough cyanide to kill an elephant, and the man was singing folk songs. The supernatural reputation of Rasputin suddenly felt very real. Was he immortal? Was he truly protected by the devil? "I have a burning in my stomach," Rasputin muttered at one point. "Give me some tea." Felix gave him tea. The monk recovered. He stood up and walked around the room admiring a cabinet. He picked up a guitar and began to play a clumsy tune. It was now 2:30 a.m. upstairs. The other conspirators, Grand Duke Dmitri, Purishkevich, and Sukhotin, were pacing the floor, wondering what was taking so long. Felix made an excuse to leave the room. "I will go see if Irina's guests have left," he said. He ran up the spiral stairs, bursting into the room where his friends waited. He was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "He won't die," Felix whispered hoarsely. "He ate it all. The poison isn't working. He's the devil incarnate." The conspirators were stunned. Purishkevich, the fiery politician, wanted to go down and strangle him. But Dmitri, ever the soldier, handed Felix his own service revolver, a Browning. "You have to finish it," Dmitri said. "Go down and shoot him." Felix took the gun. He felt the weight of it, cold steel against his sweating palm. This was the moment of no return. The poisoner is a coward's role, a passive killer. The gunman is active. He had to look him in the eye. Felix went back down. Rasputin was sitting at the table, his head low, breathing heavily. He looked up as Felix entered. The alcohol had made his eyes glassy, but they still held that terrifying power. "Are they gone?" Rasputin asked slurredly. "Yes," Felix said. He walked to the crystal cabinet. "Grigory Efimovich, look at this crucifix. It is beautiful crystal." Rasputin stood and lumbered over to the cabinet. He stared at the crystal cross. "Say a prayer, Grigory," Felix said softly. Rasputin turned his head to look at Felix. At that exact moment, Felix raised the revolver and fired. The shot was deafening in the stone room. The bullet hit Rasputin in the chest, near the heart. The giant monk roared, a sound more animal than human, and collapsed onto the white bearskin rug. He thrashed for a moment, then lay still. Felix dropped the gun. It was over. The monster was dead. The conspirators rushed down the stairs. They examined the body. There was a bullet hole, blood seeping into the white fur. Dr. Lazovert checked for a pulse. "He is dead," he announced. The relief was overwhelming. They turned off the lights, locked the cellar door, and went upstairs to celebrate. They began to plan the disposal of the body. Dmitri and the others went to the car to prepare it, but Felix couldn't rest. A strange, morbid curiosity drew him back. He felt a magnetic pull from the cellar. He had to be sure. He went back down alone. The room was shadowy. Rasputin lay on the rug, a dark heap. Felix approached him. He shook the body. No movement. Then Felix noticed something. The monk's left eye began to twitch. Felix froze. Suddenly, both of Rasputin's eyes flew open. They were not the eyes of a dead man. They were the eyes of pure, concentrated hate. They were yellow and burning. Before Felix could scream, Rasputin lunged. The dead man scrambled to his feet, roaring. He grabbed Felix by the throat with fingers like iron bands. He dug his nails into Felix's neck. He grabbed the epaulet of Felix's tunic and ripped it off. "You bad boy!" Rasputin screamed, his voice a gargling, blood-filled bellow. "I will tell the Empress. I will tell everything." The psychological horror of this moment cannot be overstated. For Felix, this was his childhood nightmare coming to life. The bad boy being punished by the ultimate father figure, the unkillable giant. Felix tore himself free, screaming in sheer terror. He ran up the spiral stairs. Behind him, he heard the heavy, wet thud of Rasputin crawling on his hands and knees, dragging his body up the steps, hissing and growling. "He's alive! He's alive!" Felix screamed as he burst into the courtyard where Purishkevich was waiting. Rasputin burst out of the side door into the snowy courtyard. He was bleeding from the chest, poisoned and shot, but he was running. He was heading for the iron gate that led to the street. If he made it to the street, if he found a policeman, the Yusupovs were finished. Purishkevich pulled out his own pistol. He fired 2 shots at the running figure. He missed. He fired a third. He missed again. Rasputin was reaching for the gate. "God help me!" Purishkevich shouted, steadied his hand, and fired a 4th time. The bullet hit Rasputin in the back. He stumbled. A 5th shot hit him in the back of the head. Rasputin fell into the snowbank. He tried to crawl, scraping the ice with his fingernails, but his strength was finally broken. Felix, driven by a hysterical frenzy, ran to the body. He grabbed a weighted rubber truncheon and began to beat the fallen monk. He beat him with all the pent-up rage of the last 2 years, venting his horror, his fear, and his disgust. He had to destroy the monster so completely that it could never rise again. The conspirators dragged the battered body back into the palace. They wrapped it in a blue curtain. They bound the hands and feet with rope. They loaded the heavy bundle into Dmitri's car and drove through the dark city to the Petrovsky Bridge. The Neva River was frozen, but there was a hole in the ice near the bridge supports. They stopped the car. It was hurried and chaotic. They heaved the body over the railing. It splashed into the black water and vanished under the ice. But in their panic, they made a mistake. They forgot to attach the weights, and they left one of Rasputin's galoshes, rubber boots, sitting on the bridge, piling, a silent piece of evidence pointing exactly to where the crime had happened. Felix returned to the Moika Palace as the sun began to rise. He was exhausted, traumatized, and stained with blood. He collapsed into bed. He thought he had saved Russia. He thought the nightmare was over. But the next morning, the flip-flop of public opinion began. A policeman had heard the shots. Blood was found in the courtyard of the Moika. The boot was found on the bridge. The river was dragged. When the news broke that Rasputin was missing and that Prince Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitri were involved, Petrograd did not gasp in horror. It cheered. People poured into the streets. In the cathedrals of St. Petersburg, where Rasputin had been feared as a heretic, believers lit candles in front of the icons of St. Dmitri and St. Felix. The painted boy, the cross-dresser, the cabaret singer, was suddenly the Lion of Russia. Aristocrats called the Moika Palace to leave cards of congratulations. Officers drank toasts to the prince's aim. For a few delirious days, Felix Yusupov was the most popular man in the empire. He had done what the generals could not do. He had cut out the cancer, but the body had not yet been found, and until it was, the empress refused to believe her friend was dead. She sat in the winter palace, white-faced and trembling, demanding that the murderers be hanged. 3 days later, the river gave up its secret. The police found the body frozen under the ice layer. When they pulled him out, his hands were raised above his head, as if he had tried to claw through the ice in his final moments. The autopsy revealed water in his lungs. The poison hadn't killed him. The bullet to the heart hadn't killed him. The bullet to the head hadn't killed him. The cold water had finally drowned him. He had been alive when he hit the river. The monster was dead. But the curse of the Yusupovs was not done with Felix yet. The murder had removed the man, but it had shattered the fragile dam holding back the revolution. Felix had hoped to save the Tsar. Instead, he had just fired the starting gun for the end of the world. The Empress Alexandra demanded a state funeral for Rasputin. He was buried in a secret ceremony on the grounds of the imperial park, with the Tsar and his family acting as pallbearers. They buried a peasant like a king. Meanwhile, Felix and Dmitri were placed under house arrest in the Moika Palace. The windows were barred, guards stood at the doors, but outside those windows the crowds gathered not to protest, but to sing patriotic songs. Inside his gilded cage, Felix sat in the very room where the murder had been planned. He could still smell the gunpowder. He could still hear the phantom voice screaming, "You bad boy!" He realized then that he would never be free of Rasputin. He had killed the man, but he had bound himself to the legend forever. History would not remember Felix Yusupov for his wealth, his beauty, or his art. It would remember him only as the man who killed the monk. And in the silence of his arrest, Felix waited for the Tsar's judgment. He expected execution, but the Romanovs were paralyzed. They could not execute the man the people called a savior. So they chose the one punishment that Felix had feared all his life, yet had been rehearsing for since his childhood games. They chose exile. The punishment for the murder of the century was surprisingly mild, a testament to the chaotic paralysis gripping the Romanov throne. While the Empress demanded execution, the Tsar, perhaps secretly relieved that the mad monk was gone, or perhaps fearing the immense popularity of the killers, chose banishment. Grand Duke Dmitri was sent to the Persian front, a dangerous assignment that would ironically save his life when the Bolshevik firing squads began their work in St. Petersburg. Felix was exiled to his country estate at Rakitnoy, a sprawling property in the Kursk province. It was a soft prison. He traveled in his private railway car, accompanied by his wife Irina, his daughter, and a retinue of servants. At every station along the route, crowds gathered not to jeer, but to cheer. They waved flags and held up icons. They saw Felix not as a criminal, but as a deliverer. For a few brief weeks in the winter of 1917, Felix Yusupov was the uncrowned hero of Russia. He believed he had done it. He believed he had lanced the boil and that the fever of revolution would now break. He was wrong. He had not stopped the avalanche. He had merely shouted at the snow. Less than 3 months after Rasputin's body hit the Neva River, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. The bread riots in Petrograd turned into an uprising. The soldiers mutinied. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in a railway carriage, ending 300 years of imperial rule with the stroke of a pen. The holy Russia that Felix had tried to save with a poisoned cake dissolved into the chaos of the provisional government, and soon the blood-red tide of Bolshevism. The Moika Palace, the scene of the crime and the symbol of Yusupov power, was raided. Bolshevik soldiers, muddy and angry, tramped through the white marble halls. They smashed the rock crystal chandeliers. They slashed the tapestries. And when they reached Felix's private apartments, they found the physical evidence of his secret life. They pulled out the silk dresses, the wigs, the makeup kits, and the women's shoes, The revolutionaries held them up with sneers, using them as propaganda to paint the aristocracy not just as oppressors, but as deviants. The prince in the dress became a caricature of the old world's rot. Felix and Irina were far away in the Crimea, huddled with the Dowager Empress and other surviving Romanovs. The atmosphere was one of terrified boredom. They were prisoners in their own summer palaces, waiting for the news that they would be executed. The sailors guarding them were becoming increasingly hostile, debating openly whether to shoot them all in the courtyard. But fate, or perhaps the lingering luck of his name, intervened. In 1919, the British battleship HMS Marlborough was sent by King George V to rescue his aunt, the Dowager Empress. Felix and Irina were offered a passage. The departure was a scene of tragic absurdity. The Yusupovs, who had once required entire trains to move their luggage, now had to pack their lives into a few trunks. Felix, ever the aesthete and the pragmatist, made a crucial decision. He could not take the land, the mines, or the palaces. He could only take what he could carry. He went to the hiding place where he had stashed the most valuable portable assets. He took a sack of diamonds. He took 2 rolled-up canvases by Rembrandt, Portrait of a Gentleman with a Tall Hat, and Portrait of a Lady with an Ostrich Feather Fan. These paintings, worth millions, were stuffed unceremoniously into a cabin on a warship. As the Marlborough steamed away from the Crimean coast, Felix stood on the deck watching the dark shoreline of Russia recede into the mist. He was 32 years old. He was leaving behind a fortune estimated at $500 million in today's money. He was leaving behind the grave of his brother, the palaces of his ancestors, and the ghost of the monk he had murdered. He would never set foot on Russian soil again. They landed in Europe, drifting first to London and then inevitably to Paris. Paris in the 1920s was the capital of the White Russian exiles. It was a city of ghosts, generals driving taxis, countesses sewing lace, and princes waiting tables. But Felix Yusupov was not a man to wait tables. He and Irina settled in Boulogne-sur-Seine. They had managed to smuggle out enough jewels and the Rembrandts to maintain a semblance of their old life, though on a much smaller scale. To the French, Felix was a celebrity of the highest order. He was the man who killed Rasputin. He was a living legend, a character from a Dostoevsky novel come to life. But Felix refused to be a museum piece. He needed to create. He needed to perform. In 1924, he and Irina founded a fashion house called IRFE, an acronym of their first names. It was a brilliant move. Felix used his impeccable taste, his lifelong obsession with fabric and design, and his notoriety to launch the brand. The clothes were dramatic, Russian-influenced, and impeccably to cut. For the launch party, the models were real Russian princesses and countesses, desperate for work. The press went wild. For a few years, IRFE was the toast of Paris. Felix was back in his element, surrounded by beauty, dictating style, the center of attention. He was no longer hiding his eccentricities. He flaunted them. He was known for wearing makeup openly, foundation to palliate his skin, kohl to darken his eyes. In 1920s Paris, this was avant-garde, almost fashionable. The cross-dressing prince had found a world that finally accepted him, not as a deviation, but as an artist. However, Felix was a terrible businessman. He was a Yusupov. He had never learned the value of money because he had never needed to. He gave dresses away to friends. He hired fellow exiles who had no skills simply because they were hungry. He threw lavish parties that ate up the profits. By the Great Depression, IRFE had collapsed. The money began to run out. The Rembrandts had to be sold. The diamonds were pawned one by one. But just as financial ruin threatened to turn the prince into a pauper, the ghost of Rasputin returned to save him one last time. In 1932, the Hollywood studio MGM released a blockbuster film titled Rasputin and the Empress. It was a sensationalized retelling of the events leading up to the revolution. In the film, the character based on Felix, called Prince Shagodiev, murders Rasputin. But the film added a salacious twist. It implied that Rasputin had seduced and raped the prince's wife, a character clearly based on Irina, and that the murder was an act of revenge for this sexual defilement. Felix was furious. He didn't mind being portrayed as a murderer. He was proud of that. But he would not tolerate the slander of his wife. Irina, the quiet, reserved Romanov, had never even met Rasputin until the moment Felix used her name as bait. They sued MGM for libel in an English court. It was a landmark case. The studio lawyers argued that because Rasputin was a public figure and the prince was a killer, they had license to dramatize. Felix's lawyers argued that while the murder was a matter of history, the rape was a lie that destroyed a living woman's reputation. The courtroom was packed. Felix took the stand, elegant and defiant. He charmed the jury. He recounted the night of the murder with chilling precision, correcting the scriptwriters on the details of how the cyanide was administered, how the shots were fired. He controlled the narrative. The jury found in favor of the Yusupovs. MGM was ordered to pay a massive settlement, £25,000, a huge sum at the time. This money secured their financial future and allowed them to live out their days in comfort. More importantly, the case changed the film industry forever. Because of Felix Yusupov, Hollywood studios began inserting a standard disclaimer in the credits of every movie: all persons fictitious. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It is known in legal circles as the Yusupov disclaimer. Even in exile, Felix had forced the world to play by his rules. The decades rolled on. The Second World War came and went. Felix refused to support the Nazis, despite their attempts to woo the anti-Bolshevik Russian exiles. He remained a patriot to a Russia that no longer existed. As he aged, Felix became a fragile bird-like figure. He never lost his vanity. Visitors to his Paris apartment in the 1960s described an old man who still wore a touch of rouge, whose hair was dyed, and who sat surrounded by the fading photographs of the imperial court. He was a relic, a living fossil from the time of the Tsars. He wrote his memoirs, Lost Splendor, in 1952. In them, he finally told the full story of his cross-dressing, his relationship with Dmitri, and the murder. He wrote with a candor that was shocking for the time. He did not apologize. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply explained that he was a man who had tried to find beauty in a world of ugliness. Irina, his constant companion, died in February 1970, but Felix went first. On September 27, 1967, at the age of 80, Prince Felix Yusupov died in Paris. The Yusupov curse had said that no male heir would survive past 26. Felix had beaten the curse by 54 years, but in a way the curse had won. It had taken his brother, it had taken his fortune, it had taken his country, and it had taken the world he was built for. He died the last of his kind, a prince without a principality. They buried him in the Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois Russian cemetery outside Paris, the final resting place of the exiled aristocracy. His grave is simple, marked by a Russian Orthodox cross. But the true monument to Felix Yusupov is the complex, contradictory legend he left behind. History usually demands that we pick a side. You are either the hero or the villain. You are the masculine soldier or the effeminate dandy. You are the conservative monarchist or the radical rebel. Felix refused to choose. He was the boy who felt most powerful in his mother's dresses, yet he was the man who committed the most violent political assassination of the 20th century. He was the husband who loved his wife deeply, yet his soul was tied to Grand Duke Dmitri. He was the wealthiest man in the world who died living off the settlement from a Hollywood lawsuit. In the end, Felix Yusupov teaches us that identity is not a rigid cage, but a fluid performance. He played every role he was assigned: prince, son, crossdresser, killer, exile, with absolute commitment. On that freezing night in 1916, when he looked into the eyes of the mad monk and pulled the trigger, he wasn't just killing a man. He was trying to kill the chaos that threatened his world. He failed to save the empire, but in the process he saved himself. He escaped the gray, suffocating expectations of his birth and became the only thing he ever truly wanted to be: unique. The snow has long since melted on the Neva River. The Moika Palace is now a museum where tourists stare at wax figures in a basement. But if you listen closely to the silence of history, you can still hear the faint, mocking laughter of the prince, echoing from a cabaret stage in St. Petersburg, forever dancing between the light and the dark, forever refusing to be anything but himself.